Hello, welcome to my talk, Tracing Your Military Ancestors. I'm Chris Baker, a military historian. I've been researching soldiers for a living for the last 12 years and part-time for many years before that, beginning with my own hobby, which grew out of my own family history research. I'm going to use my clicker. I'm going to use the screen that I've got in front of me so I can see the same slides that you're seeing. I'm going to be covering the origin of the various military records that you may find useful, where they are today, how to get the best of them, and so forth. But I'm going to start with my own grandfather, Frank Wilson. Now, Frank died before I was born, but he is the reason I do what I do today. I started trying to research him almost as soon as I learned that these things could be done. I'd only got a couple of things that came down through my mother. We got this photograph, we got one of his campaign medals, and a story that he'd been in the Navy, but here he is in the photograph, clearly in the Army. Now, in the days before the internet, when all these records, those that were in the public domain, were in dusty archives, I went down to the National Archives in Kew and I found his Great War Medal records, not a trace of any service record at all. And I wrote away to the Ministry of Defence for a naval record and was amazed when they came back saying he doesn't exist. Now, I went round and round in circles for many, many years, but he became a case study for me because I got a breakthrough with Frank in much more recent years with the digitisation of a new set of records. It opened up a lot more stuff for me. A set of Army records came out, and I just put his name and year of birth in just to test it out, more or less. And up he came. It was something I wasn't expecting. He was not in the regiment that I can see in his photograph, and it was well before this photograph was taken. But luckily for me, a clerk had written on it that he'd been discharged from that service. He was in the militia of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. He'd gone to join the Royal Marines. Fine, that explains why I hadn't got a naval record. But it also told me that he'd enlisted under a different surname. Wow, I had no idea. I didn't even know where that surname came from, and I still don't. But a fantastic story for me when doing this kind of talk, because he's a great example of how the digitisation and easier access of records and searching them really helps with this stuff. I'd have been doing this for decades without it and without making any progress. It also underpins how important it is to be flexible in your thinking, because here I am, a man named Frank Wilson who served under a totally different name, and I would never have known. So, great example, and he's the reason that I've gone into all of this stuff over the years. Now, when you're considering looking into the service of someone with a military or naval background in your own family, it really pays to dig in first before you start looking for any records and try and understand the individual you're looking for. Obviously, some basics. Try and know his full name, know his year of birth at least, if not his full date of birth, where he came from, who he might have named of his next of kin. All of these things can appear in different records and help you sort out your individual from amongst others of the same name. All obvious stuff. But many families will also have artifacts and documents that would be most valuable. And if you haven't got them, do go back around your family and see if these things do exist. If he had any medals from any of his service, they will usually have his name, regiment, number inscribed on them somewhere. If there were any documents to do with his discharge or granting of a pension after service, these things will have important details on them as well. It's amazing how many times I find my clients have got these things tucked away somewhere and they hadn't thought of it before understanding they were going to go into a search, and knowing these extra bits of fine detail really make life very much more easy. So if you've got any of this stuff around you in the family, make sure you've got it and know what it says and get the main details out before you start searching. Now, to understand the records and where they are today, it's important to know how they were originated and what they were for. And to do that, I'm just going to go through the basics of a military career and how it generated a paper trail. Now, in this instance, I'm talking about Army, but it's just the same in Navy or Air Force terms. The documents are different, but essentially the cycle of events was the same. A man turns up somewhere to enlist into the army, and the documentation begins from that very day. They start asking him about his name, his age, where he's from, what his occupation is, has he ever served before. All these things start to be written down. Beware, no evidence was required of the facts given, hence why my grandfather could enlist under a different name, and many people did that. They falsified their ages. So you need to be a bit flexible. Searching hard on the name, place and year may get you the result, but equally you may need to have a little bit of latitude in what you're looking for. He went through a period of training, more documentation starts to be developed, and when, for instance, at a time of conflict, he is sent overseas on active service, more documents start to proliferate. Every time he is posted to a unit, every time he's promoted or demoted, every time he gets into trouble and has some kind of punishment, they're all written down somewhere, generating fragments of different information. Many men become a casualty. They're either wounded, gassed, killed in action, missing in action, taken prisoner. Beware, the army uses the word casualty in a wider context. There are documents you will find called casualty form active service, where a man didn't become a casualty in the sense that we know it at all. Casualty meant essentially leaving his unit for some reason or other. And so don't always get wrapped up into the fact that it might say casualty on a document somewhere, meaning that he was admitted to hospital or anything. Now, obviously, some men went round a loop between service and being a casualty on more than one occasion. And each time, more documentation was created. Using a separate set of War Office forms, these things were all laid out on forms that the administrators used. And as the man comes to the end of his service for demobilisation and discharge, yet more documents were raised. Once he's out of service, he would be issued with campaign medals, perhaps he would be given a disability pension or a long service pension, and yet more documents are raised as a result of that. So from the whole flow of his story, many, many documents are created. Some of those documents we call a service record. Now, in the army, a service record is not a single document. It is a collection of documents through most of his career. You can imagine it like they're being pinned together. In the most extreme case, I've found service records of more than 100 documents. But sadly, as you may know, for the First World War period, a very large number of these records were destroyed in a fire in the Blitz in 1940, so they don't exist at all. Where they are found, you're more likely to find perhaps 5, 10, 15, 20 documents, many of them damaged, often faded, but they contain vital fragments of information, not necessarily in chronological order, so it's a question of pulling them out into some sequence that you can understand. I'll talk about where these records are and how they can be found in a moment. It is surprising how often a soldier was mentioned in his local newspapers. They didn't all do this the same. Some of the bigger city newspapers clearly don't go down to the same level of detail that the more rural ones do. But you can find instances of a man being mentioned when he goes home on leave or when he's promoted, certainly if he becomes a casualty or if he's sent somewhere odd or comes home to get married or some such. So newspapers can be a very rich source of military information, even though, of course, they're not an official source of that information. The issue of pensions and medals created documentation. Most of that documentation still exists. If you can't find a service record, clearly these things are only going to give you small fragments rather than the complete story, but it's amazing how much information you can drag from analysis of that information. Unfortunately, if the man served in one of the larger corps, like the artillery, the engineers, the Army Service Corps, or the Labour Corps, for instance, the information that can be gained from medal records is limited. They very rarely give you the man's unit, for example, but they're a vital piece of the story, and if his service record's not there, they are a vital addition for you, and in fact may be the only thing that you're going to find. As we track back, documentation to do with death and burial or commemoration can be found, casualty lists, admissions to hospital, although there's only a sample of these things left now, not the full range of admission registers that once existed. Enquiries about men who were missing, going to the Red Cross, information coming back from Germany or elsewhere about them can be incredibly rich, mentioning addresses, next of kin and so forth. And during his service, if he got a gallantry or a bravery award, they will be documented. It's not likely, unless he was an officer, that he will be mentioned by name in the war diary of his unit, but it's worth looking. And of course, there are all sorts of rolls of honour, regimental histories and the like. In other words, across this whole map, there's a huge potential array of information to be gathered. The question is where it is, how to find it, and how to figure out what it's telling you.
We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like. To watch the extended, uninterrupted version, go to familyhistory.tv, link in the description. You will also find a host of talks from other experts on a variety of subjects. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when these videos become available.